But for the Soviet Union, the great air battles of World War II were a sideshow. From the beginning, the struggle along the vast and bloody Eastern Front was a war which would be won and lost on the ground. By now, Stalin had forgiven Tupolev and restored him to his pre-war eminence. When the B-29s fell into Soviet hands, Stalin ordered Tupolev to copy the airframe. Only a year later, the Soviet copy was ready to fly. It was given the designation Tu-4. The bomber was a clone of the B-29. All of the castings were molded from the American bomber, right down to the rudder pedals, which bore the name Boeing. The West soon began its habit of giving nicknames to Soviet aircraft. All bombers began with the letter B. In 1947, Western authorities were shocked to see the first 3 Tu-4s flying in the Aviation Day parade. The new Soviet bomber would become known as the Bull. The Bull didn't enter service until 1949. That same year, America learned that Stalin had got his hands on something far more dangerous than the Boeing airframe. The Soviets had detonated an atomic bomb of their own. Suddenly, America's nuclear monopoly disappeared in a menacing atomic cloud, rising over a desolate stretch of eastern Russia. A new war was looming, a war between East and West, where the threat of nuclear annihilation hung precariously along a thin line of diplomacy. The Cold War had begun in earnest. This is the Tupolev Tu-16. Because it's jet-powered, NATO gave it a 2-syllable code name, the Badger. It flew for the first time in 1952, roughly the same period as the American B-52. Although it didn't match the B-52's speed or range, it was a major step for Andrei Tupolev and the Red Air Force. Between 1952 and 1958, almost 2,000 Badgers were produced for the Russian air and naval forces. The Tu-16 Badger originated from Stalin's demand for a bomber to replace the Tu-4 Bull. A design competition was held between Andrei Tupolev's design bureau and the bureau of Sergei Ilyushin. Ilyushin had gained favor with Stalin during the Second World War and was the man behind the Soviet Union's first jet bomber, the Il-28. In creating the Il-28, Ilyushin combined his experience of building twin-engined wartime bombers with borrowed jet technology from the British. All early Russian jets were copies of the Rolls-Royce Nene engine, which had been exported before the onset of the Cold War. Using 2 such engines, Ilyushin produced a tactical straight-wing bomber capable of traveling over 750 kilometers an hour at low level. The Il-28 was built in great numbers, and over 1,000 were exported to countries throughout the world. It had been a success. So when Sergei Ilyushin threw his hat into the strategic bomber competition, his design was simply an updated model of the Il-28. Tupolev presented the military with a more cutting-edge design. It had swept wings stretching a distance of 34 meters, and 2 engines recessed into the sides of the fuselage at the wing roots. The Badger had a crew of 6. 2 pilots sat in the main cockpit, with the navigator sitting in the glazed nose section. 2 of the crew were gunners, with the forward position operated from a bubble behind the cockpit. The rear gunner sat in a turret at the back of the fuselage. All of its defensive positions were also based on World War II ideas. but its highly swept wings and engine configuration brought Tupolev into the modern age. It was a contemporary of the legendary British V-bombers, and like the V-bombers, it was initially meant to carry nuclear weapons. The Badger carried up to 3,600 kilos of bombs. But not all Tu-16s were bombers. During its long service life, NATO identified at least a dozen different versions, from maritime patrol to electronic warfare. During the early 60s, the desire for long-range naval aircraft gave the Badger a new lease of life. Tu-16s were transferred to the Soviet Naval Air Service, becoming its first airborne missile carriers. The first was the Tu-16KS, often called Badger B. The Badger B was fit to carry standoff anti-shipping missiles like the turbojet AS-1, which NATO called the Kennel. One of the more successful Badgers was the tanker version, Tu-16N. The tanker could hold almost 54,000 liters of fuel. The hose was stowed on a large reel in the bomb bay. When it was time to refuel, the hose was let out through the starboard wingtip. With careful piloting, it would catch a drogue on the port wingtip of another Badger. Once in place, the tanker transferred 990 liters per minute. The first Badger N took to the sky in 1963 to serve a new generation of Soviet bombers. But new Soviet bombers were fitted with more conventional refueling probes. The unique wingtip-to-wingtip configuration could only be used to refuel other Badgers. This Tu-16 variant doesn't have the glazed nose canopy of the original Badger. The Tu-16K-10, also called Badger C, was developed to carry the deadly supersonic AS-2 Kipper anti-shipping missile. A search and tracking radar was installed in the nose section to guide the missile for 225 kilometers. The Badger C first flew in 1958, but it didn't enter service with the Soviet Navy until the missile was ready in 1961.